Yo, what is good, high performers? Welcome to another episode of the Can't Believe I Made It podcast. I'm your podcast host and habit expert, Desi Abeda. So this is inside of our Rituals for Resilience episodes. This last week, we actually ended up taking a small break. I got to be honest, the flu punched me in the face. And so throughout the course of this whole recording, you might find or hear rather me having a coughing fit. So I'm going to do my best to edit those things out. But there was something last week that I think was incredibly imperative that happened for me that I think is going to be really helpful for you. I had just also released an article inside a Men's Health magazine talking about the mindful benefits of drinking and what that does for your health. And it got me thinking, oftentimes we're really caught up in this fast-paced world of constantly what I like to refer to as time traveling. We're either thinking about what has happened in the past or constantly thinking about what's happening in the future. And this last week, I think at any point when you get sick or you have an injury or something happens in your life that you didn't plan for, you get reminded about how really beautiful health and life is, because it's a reminder, because at any point, like, it could be done. And I think one of the fears that most people have that they don't really want to acknowledge is the fear of death and the fear of regret. And this last week, and while I wasn't really thinking about death, I was thinking about how hard it is to come back from an injury or how hard it is to come back from an illness to try to get to a level that I was used to performing at. And I think that's incredibly relative when we think about mindfulness as a tactic, because we're constantly in this trance of thinking of getting caught up of what we should be doing, our own expectations. And for a lot of us, and for a lot of you listening to this podcast, you're a high level individual who is looking to do really beautiful things in your life by making sure that you're advocating for your health, your mental health, your habits, your relationships, and all the really beautiful things that make you. What I'm tending to find in having a lot of conversations with clients that I have or people that I'm working with, or even just with other mental health or mindset coaches in the space, one of the things that I'm seeing across the board is we are constantly doing time traveling. We're constantly thinking about the past and constantly thinking about the future, but we don't really give a lot of energy into the present moment. And I tend to think that's a little bit more on the side of fear. Like, we fear constantly at not being good enough. And that inevitably is going to affect how we show up in our lives. And I think this last week, what a really great reminder for me is while I wasn't able to perform at 90 to 100% or even just the 80%, so that there's 20% humanhood, if you will. I just created a new word. Thank you very much. I tend to find that if you kind of go back and you kind of start to think about like the ways in which you want to perform, there is this unending fear that we're going to be showing up in a way and people aren't going to accept us, or we're not going to accept ourselves. And I think this mindfulness tool that I've come across a couple times, and one that I've seen in some of the professional and collegiate spaces, is one that I swear by. Now, if you think back at how sports psychology and how some of these mindset and mindfulness coaches have come into the scene, we were able to see that actually at a national stage. So a couple weeks ago, if you're a Michigan fan, shout out to you. Congratulations to y'all. But the starting quarterback, JJ McCarthy, they were doing a really great bit on his mindfulness technique before he goes out into the field of play. So what JJ McCarthy ends up doing each and every game is he'll go out and he'll do some grounding. So bare feet on the floor. It's a really intentional aspect of helping you to engage in the present moment. What he'll end up doing is doing a little bit of breath work and then some meditation. What I thought was really fantastic is they started asking him about his pregame ritual, and he gave a bunch of flowers to the sports psychologist that was teaching their high-level athletes on how to engage in the present moment. And it got me thinking a little bit more, because we literally in the last season just had Harvey Martin, who is the human performance coach of the San Francisco Giants. I know I've mentioned him a couple times in this podcast in this newest season, because a lot of the work that he's doing, I think, is so monumental, because he's really just helping athletes to engage in the present moment and to engage in their breath. And that's where I think most people really miss out on, is because if you're constantly thinking about what you should be doing, or you're constantly thinking about the things that you have done, or maybe that you have judgment about, you're losing opportunities to engage in the present moment, where that's where the neuroplasticity happens. That's where all of those messages, those neural pathways of habits and rituals that we want to be engaging in, or even thought process that we want to be engaging in, we lose out on those moments when we're constantly doing this time traveling of thinking that a lot of us get lost in. So I wanted to introduce to you the concept of the acronym RAIN. It's an acronym that teaches you radical compassion because a lot of us are going to need that. And oftentimes we're probably going to be much more comfortable giving compassion to our friends, our family, our kids, like the people that we care about. But the last person that we're going to give compassion to is ourselves. And this is where we've talked about this in past seasons of this radical responsibility piece. I want to implement something here that is not only radical responsibility of the present moment, but also radical compassion. So inside of this acronym, and I learned this a couple years ago, and it's something that I continue to go back to when I start to feel like I'm doing that time traveling, where I'm constantly thinking about all the things that I need to do or where I want to go, or merely thinking about all the things that I've messed up in the past. And so this 4-step process inside of this acronym is going to be R for recognize, A for allow, I for investigate, and N for nurture. Let's map this out a little bit of how this might play out. So let's say you're encountering a lot of stress in your current life, whether it's stress about your health, stress about your business or your career, or maybe even just your relationships. That's where we get into that time traveling, constantly thinking about what we should be doing or what we have done. So what I would love to help you to implement today is this concept into maybe a moment where you might feel really, really uncomfortable, or an uncomfortable feeling is coming up, maybe just an uncomfortable thought process. I want you to be thinking about this acronym. So let's start with the R, recognize. When we recognize a uncomfortable feeling or a moment or an environment, this is where mindfulness can step in. Because if we're able to recognize and identify predominant feelings that we have about your current state of life, your current moment, or even just the feeling, we take out the judgment. Because the measure here, and I've talked about Brené Brown a million times on this podcast, so shout out to her. I hope to be on her pod at some point, or even her on mine. She's a dream guest. That's neither here nor there. But she talks about the concept of shame, and if you were to grow that inside of a petri dish, it's going to need one of 3 things to continue to proliferate and survive. So it's going to be silence, judgment, and secrecy. So the only antidote to that is vulnerability. And I think what is really important to note here is that being able to recognize, and then the next part is going to be the A, which is allow. Being able to recognize a feeling and allow the feeling to come in, I think is a really vulnerable process. I mean, I felt that last week. You know, we're talking a great deal about mindfulness inside of your relationship with alcohol this month as we explore ways in which not only we can get our needs met that isn't constantly alcohol, but in this case, getting our needs met in things that are actually going to fulfill us and actually fill our cup in a really authentic way. What I think is important to note is that inside of this vulnerable process, if you allow yourself to have this feeling, it speaks towards your humanity. Because we're not robots. We're not constantly going to be performing at a high level. There's going to be moments, there's going to be dips. And what I think is important to note is that as these dips happen, if we actually allow them and allow the humanity of what's going on for us, some really beautiful things can happen in the long run. Because as we go down into this acronym, as we recognize the feeling and then allow the feeling to happen, or allow the present moment to happen, this is where we can actually start to investigate. Because investigation offers curiosity. I talked about this the other day with a client of just starting to be curious about some of the hardships that come up, some of the new nuances of what's happening in your life. Because if you can approach a feeling and a current state that you're uncomfortable with through the lens of curiosity, then you get to start asking yourself questions. Questions like, why is this important to me? Why is this feeling uncomfortable for me? Where has this feeling come in the past, and how have I handled it? Why do I handle certain feelings or certain instances or certain triggers in certain ways? Because when you're able to be curious, you get to take out the judgment. And I know for a lot of us, we're pretty big assholes to ourselves, right? I'll raise my hand right now and say, like, 100%, I hold myself to a standard that I don't hold others to. And sometimes it gets me in my own way. And it's a huge barrier to what progression looks like in my life. And I think for a lot of you who are listening to this podcast, it's probably the same thing for you. Because if we can investigate and become curious about the present moment, the feeling that's coming up, then we can nurture. Because nurturing is a funny thing. Nurturing offers complete vulnerability into who you are as an individual, because it speaks towards how you show up in relationships, how you show up in your progression within your personal development, your career, your performance, if you're an athlete, or your performance just mainly of someone who's trying to be a high level individual. Nurturing is really not something that's talked about, because if we're able to nurture ourselves and implement things like kindness or different ways to nurture, where we can include ways in which we get our cup full, this is where the real opportunity is. Now, I tend to find that there's a lot of comfort and discomfort with comedy, especially when you're in pain, right? We kind of think about comedians out there are probably the most hurt people. But if you really think about it, and this is kind of this is a tactic that I've learned, that I've really tried to implement with a lot of clients that I've seen some success with, is that if there is an uncomfortable thought pattern or an uncomfortable feeling, is to almost personify that thought in a way where you're belittling it. So like growing up, we used to, one of the names that we used to give to people that bothered us, or like different types of, characteristics that bother you, we would call them Melvins, right? And what I tend to do, and I think is important, and this is something that I would offer to you as we bring in comedy and bring in this nurturing aspect, that if a thought pattern comes up, maybe a thought pattern like you're not good enough, or you're never going to make it, or look what everyone else is doing, but you're not, you can personify that in a comedic way. So what I tend to do with some of those thought processes is I'll say like, look, Melvin, shut the hell up. Your thoughts are not welcome right now. And I think that this is another realm of nurturing. So whether you're someone who really holds on to comedy, I would tell you like, hey, personify these thought patterns and give it a name that you don't really give a damn about. Or if you're on the other side of someone who really likes to be nurtured in a way where you like to feel supported, this is where having community, or this is where having a person to go to of just helping them to examine your thought patterns. And that even might sound like, hey, I just want to say something out loud. You don't have to say anything, but like, I'm having some thoughts about feeling inadequate about where I'm at in my life currently. I feel like I should have been further. And what you can help them to do is you can help them to understand that they don't really need to say anything. They just need to listen, because sometimes when we hear some of these thought patterns out loud, we truly get to see how asinine the thought is. And that's where we get to bring things out in the open. That's where vulnerability really takes a strong stance, because if we look at the aftermath, if you're able to implement this RAIN concept, what I think is really important is there's going to be a shift in perspective and feelings about that current moment. Because if you're able to recognize the feeling, allow the feeling, investigate it in a curiosity type of way, and then nurture it, this offers you opportunities for you to build awareness, and offers opportunities for you to build on this skill and this concept. And this can spread into mindfulness around food, mindfulness around movement, mindfulness around your mental health, your habits, and your rituals. And in this case, within this month, mindfulness around, let's say, your drinking habits. And this is where I think if we can start to shift our perspective, we can actually start to do some really big work. Because if you're someone who is able to use mindfulness as a tool, and you're constantly working at it in the same way that you're constantly working on your fitness, we know that as you continue to practice something, you're going to get better. This RAIN concept starts to become almost something that is subconscious. Whether that's tapping into your breath in the moment, going for a walk, or merely just staying free of distraction and just exploring the present moment and seeing what you can get out of it, a lot of really beautiful things can happen. Because being able to provide yourself the gift of trusting the goodness within you, I think, is a really, really big skill. And if you're someone who is constantly thinking about that next move, or constantly thinking about what's happened in the past, I would tell you that you are perfect for this RAIN concept. Because if you can recognize, allow the feeling, investigate it, and then nurture yourself in the process, the hope is that you start to find things that are actually fulfilling for you, and not going towards habits and rituals that are barriers to your success inside of your personal development. So I hope this is helpful today. It's something that I think was coming up for me this past week as I was coming back from healing. If I coughed in your ear right now, I'm incredibly sorry. We're still coming back, but we got some really big things this month. Next week, we're going to be having a guest that was on the list of the Forbes 30 under 30, which I'm incredibly excited to have on. And then beyond that, like I said, we have a lot of guests that I'm just super excited to tap into their stories. And then inside of these Rituals for Resilience episodes, we want to make sure that we're giving you digestible nuggets that you can take and implement today. So as always, I would encourage you, if something came up for you inside of this podcast, please make sure that you hit us up on social, tag us at iMadeItPod or at DesiAbeta. Take a screenshot of the episode and let me know one big takeaway that you're going to be taking into this next day or this next week and beyond. Love y'all. Catch you on the next one. Peace.